will be recording right now. Okay, so we'll start with Tara's talk. There you go, Tara.
Great, thank you so much, Willis. Can everybody hear me? If you can, will you indicate in the chat somehow? Great, thanks everyone. So my plan for today is to talk about building community in courses. And when we originally came up with this workshop, we were going to be talking about face-to-face teaching. So I will talk about building community in face-to-face classes, but I would like to spend most of the time talking about building community in online classes, given the situation that we all find ourselves in with the COVID-19 pandemic and having to move our courses online for the summer and the fall. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation, which should be familiar to most people, and then talking about motivation and relatedness, and thinking about relatedness as community, classroom community, and then building community in face-to-face classes and building community in online classes. At the end of my talk, which I'm aiming to make about 15 minutes here, I'm going to be asking you to respond to this question in our shared Google Doc. And the question is, how do you or how will you inspire intrinsic motivation and build community in online classes? So as I'm going through my presentation, if you come up with some ideas, if you have a brainstorm, go ahead and just put that in the Google Doc as we're going along. There will also be time at the end of my presentation to fill in the Google Doc as well, but you can be thinking about this as we go. So in the 1970s, the research into student motivation identified two different types of motivations for students, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. These, like I said, these should be terms that are fairly familiar to people, but just to give you a basic example, intrinsic motivation would be something like a desire to learn about a particular topic for your own personal goals, or to meet the requirements of a course of study that you're interested in pursuing. So that would be an intrinsic motivational factor. An extrinsic motivation generally in classes is going to be something like grades. Right. So the problem that we run into in elective courses is that students often lack intrinsic motivation. As Willis pointed out in his introduction, students are often taking these elective courses because they have to meet an arts requirement and the course fits into their schedule. Another problem in elective courses is that extrinsic motivators can actually be detrimental. So the research into extrinsic motivation shows that if you don't have the intrinsic motivation to go along with it, extrinsic motivators can actually detract from motivation and from student learning. This is because extrinsic motivators like grades in elective courses can tap into a fear response in the students. They fear that they don't have the competence to do the course, that they don't have the necessary skills to meet the expectations of the instructor. And fear is not a very good place from which to learn. It's a good place from which to be inspired to run away, right, or to fight, but it's not a good place from which to learn. So that's one way that extrinsic motivation, like a grade, can actually be detrimental. So the three basic needs of motivation then, when we're thinking about motivating students in a classroom, are competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And I'm taking these three concepts from Michelle Miller's book, Minds Online, Teaching Effectively with Technology, particularly from this chapter, Motivating Students, which I recommend to everybody as we're starting to move our courses online. So competence is being good at things. Relatedness is developing bonds with other people, developing community in the classroom. And autonomy is making our own choices. So in my presentation here, I'm talking about relatedness and community building. A little bit later, Clayton will be talking about autonomy, making our own choices. So the courses that I teach, primarily that I'm drawing from here, are courses at the 100 and 200 level. So thinking particularly about the first couple years of the Latin program and the 100 level Greek and Roman mythology course that I teach that has an enrollment cap of 150 students. So thinking about a smaller, more seminar style class, and then the larger lecture-based course. And from the student perspective, in both of these types of courses, extrinsic motivators are grades, extrinsic motivators that relate to community and relatedness are grades for attendance and participation. And then intrinsic motivators are things like desire to participate in the classroom community, right? So you can see this playing out when students want to hang out outside of class because they have created bonds and relationships, they've made friends within the classroom. Another intrinsic motivator would be reluctance to let down group members or teammates. So in my Latin 101 course this past fall, we had one student who had to run across campus every day to make it to class from his previous class. And we kind of turned this into a community building activity, right? We decided that we were never going to start class until James was there. And so we would spend those first couple minutes of class just kind of checking in with each other, hanging out a little bit, getting to know each other, but we weren't going to start the meat of the material until James arrived. So this became a fun way for all of us to bond, and it also meant that James always had to show up to class, because if he didn't show up, then we couldn't start class. And you can see the inherent silliness in that kind of thing too. So play, silliness, that kind of stuff helps to build community. Another way that another factor for intrinsic motivation for students is a desire to see each other's creations. So when you present students with an opportunity to be creative, to do creative work, not only can they get excited about showing their work to each other, but they can get excited about seeing other people's work in the class, right? So in the mythology class, I had the students create memes, and on the last day of class we presented our memes, and that day had fantastic attendance. The students were all really excited to see what other people's memes were. Now in our face-to-face classes, giving attention to community building is a very powerful way to increase student motivation in the elective courses. It is also something that comes a little bit more naturally in the face-to-face environment than in the online environment. And I've broken down community building from my perspective into these three categories. So these are, I think, three pathways to community building. The first is be a human being. The second is to allow space for individuality. and the third is to gamify activities and assignments. So ways of being a human being in the class. Of course, you have your lecture and discussion personality. This is one factor that comes pretty naturally in the face-to-face environment, right? What kind of persona do you present to the classroom when you lecture? You're probably vivacious, and you can tell jokes, and you can bring a little bit of who you are as a person into that environment. One specific way that I like to build community right off the bat and to bring some humanness into the class is through my letters to the prof. And this is something I have all my students do in all my classes at the start of the semester. I have them write a letter to me explaining what their needs are for the course. And I want them to think about their needs broadly. Their intellectual, physical, psychological needs, and thinking about those needs in terms of what do they need from me, what do they need from each other, and what do they need from themselves in order to succeed in the course. So this primes them to start thinking about their connectedness, their relatedness to the classroom community right off the bat. The other thing I like to do in the face-to-face environment to humanize it a little bit is to, where appropriate, do a Friday check-in. And that's just a 5 to 10 minute activity at the start of class on Friday, where we go around the room and everybody checks in with something positive or negative that happened in the last week. So I sometimes call those hypes and gripes, or roses and thorns, bona and mala if I'm in a Latin class, good things and bad things. And it's an opportunity for me to see where the students are at, right? I encourage them to talk about things that are outside the class, right? They don't just have to talk about good things and bad things inside of our class. It can be anything. But it is also really helpful when they bring up stuff inside the class as well, because it gives me a way to get a read on how they're handling things, how they're handling the material, where, what are times of stress in the semester, what are times where they're a little bit more relaxed and open to new things. In terms of allowing space for individuality, this often comes out naturally in the discussion. Right? So in a discussion, students are allowed to bring their own ideas into the classroom, and their space is made for that. Learning groups is something that I like to do in my courses, where I have the students break off into self-determined groups of 3 to 4 people, and they're expected to communicate with each other outside of the class. They're expected to check in with each other when one of their group members has missed class, and I'll often have them work together in class as well. And then finally, a great way to build community in a face-to-face class is to gamify activities and assignments. So I'm sure this is something that comes into all of our classrooms, right? This isn't something scary. You don't have to turn your entire course into a tabletop role-playing game, but you can bring in little aspects of gamification. So if I'm thinking about my Latin course again, it might be something like, okay, today we're going to play charades to work on vocabulary, and split the class into teams and have them compete in a very low stakes kind of way for a low stakes prize. So that's community building in the face-to-face environment. Now, when we move to the online, and I should say, I'm just kind of barreling ahead here, but if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat, and feel free to be writing things down in the Google Doc as well. Willis is monitoring the chat and the Google Doc, so we'll get to them at the end of the talks. So when we move to community building in online classes, all of these elements become more difficult, right? So it's more difficult to be a human being in a strictly online environment. One of the ways that we can facilitate this, facilitate being a human being, is to think about what our online persona is, and to cultivate that online persona. So this can be something as simple as having a text introduction to yourself, right? Maybe with a static picture, just explaining who you are, maybe where you live, who your pets are, maybe some of your relationships to other people. That helps to humanize you in the online environment. It could be a video introduction with that same information. The way that the material or the information is conveyed doesn't matter so as much as the fact that it is conveyed. It can be things like the tone that you use when you're writing communications to students. Just spend some time thinking about how you want to come across as a living, breathing human to your students in that online environment. Another important way to build community in the online environment is by taking the discussion aspect of the class off of the learning management software. So this is something that I think is articulated quite well by these two podcasts that I've listed below here, and I really do recommend giving them a listen if you have some time while you're making dinner or doing the dishes or going for a walk or something. They're really digestible. They're not very long, maybe a half hour, 45 minutes. And one of the things that these two in particular emphasize is the fact that our learning management software, so in our case, that's going to be Canvas. It's really well designed for some things, and it's not very well designed for other things. So one of the things that it's really well designed for is organizing the material of the course, right? Holding the files, holding the grade book, holding the course schedule. It's really well designed for that. It is not really well designed for discussion or for interaction. Think about the discussion feature on Canvas. It's really clunky. It's not very aesthetically appealing. It doesn't mimic at all the way that you and I would have a conversation with each other in person. It doesn't even mimic the way that you and I would have a conversation with each other online. We've all been existing in the virtual space now for the past couple months, almost exclusively. And I don't know about you, but the way that I engage in that virtual space is through group chats, right? Group text threads, group Facebook chats, texting with people over Instagram or on Twitter. I am not out here posting 300-word paragraphs and then responding with 100 words to 3 other people's 300-word paragraphs, which is how we ask students to engage in discussion on places like Canvas. So think about a platform that you might be comfortable with where you could take the course discussion. That might be something like Slack or Discord, Google Docs, or blogs or sites. Some people even like to work with Twitter in their courses, that sort of thing. So for my classes, when I had to go online this past spring, I took my courses to Discord. And I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but I just wanted to point out that one of the things that's really great about taking the classroom off the learning management software is that you can really personalize it. And by personalizing it, that makes it more human, and it makes it more like a place where people would actually engage. So just real briefly, you can see that the students, this was for my ancient Greek class, and it's in a channel that I called Professor Boulder's Ancient Greek Classroom. The students could pick their own names. I didn't even ask them to, they just all opted to pick ancient Greek names. Some of them made jokes with their names. And this little conversation here is, I'm just showing off a little bit. This is some of my students who decided that they were going to keep studying with each other even after the course had ended. And this is a conversation that two of them are having with each other in our classroom that I did not prompt at all. So this is the kind of interaction that can happen when you have a visually appealing discussion platform that really makes sense to the students. Okay. And then finally, in terms of allowing space for individuality, that's where you want to encourage the students to participate, right? So you can encourage participation through time-limited discussions. This is an idea that comes from the Miller article. So sometimes if you have a long ongoing text thread, procrastinators, people who have never joined into the discussion might be hesitant to join. So you can fix that by having some time-limited discussions. You can encourage participation early and often by grading some of the early get-to-know-you assignments, right? In a face-to-face class, you just ask people to introduce themselves and to share a fact. But when you're working online, it's really easy to ignore that kind of directive. And so this is a place where actually attaching an extrinsic motivator, like a grade, to something really goofy and simple, like a, show us a picture of your pet type of assignment can work. And then, of course, give them opportunities to showcase their work. You don't have to make these mandatory, but just give them some platforms on which they can show what they've done with one another. And then thinking about ways that we can gamify our online activities. So through light competition, collaborative assignments, games, that kind of thing. And then also really important in the online space is giving students a reason to check in daily. And this should be a reason that taps into the intrinsic motions. So they're interested, right? They want to get on, like, what's the fun fact that you're going to share about Greek and Roman mythology today? They want to check in, just like you would with Facebook, to see what new pictures have been posted or what your friends are up to. So I just like to give a minute for everybody to go to the Google Doc now and to think about how you do inspire intrinsic motivation, or how you think you might inspire intrinsic motivation and build community in your online classes. And really, anything that you come up with is great. So we'll just all pop over there, and then Willis will call you back when it's time for Clayton's talk.
Yeah, thank you, Tara. We'll spend just a minute or two reflecting, and then we'll move on to the next talk. Okay, it's great seeing all the anonymous animals flitting about on the Google Doc, but we should probably move on to Clayton's talk. We'll have a little bit of time after Clayton's talk as well to finish up thoughts before we kind of address them all. So Clayton, do you want to take it away?
Sure, yeah. So I guess I'll ask the same question. If everyone can hear me, just a thumbs up or something to let me know that my audio is working. Okay, good. All right, so my talk is going to be on encouraging student autonomy with flexible assessments. I'm going to try my hardest to keep within 15 minutes. We'll see if I get through all my slides. So I'm going to be talking about this concept of autonomy and how that is fundamental to the concept of motivation. So I'll be drawing from some of the things that Tara already talked about, but focusing on that issue of autonomy. And then I'll be more specifically talking about how flexible assessments can be a really good way to encourage that sense of autonomy for students. So I'll be looking at a kind of case study of a course that I teach to see how I've been working on this problem. It may not be directly relevant to everyone's courses, but I'm hoping it at least shows some tools that could be useful for this. And then, as has been noted by Willis and Tara, this talk was initially aimed for face-to-face teaching. So I'm going to try to come back throughout the talk to points where I think elements of this flexible assessment and sense of autonomy are directly relevant to some of the challenges we face with online teaching as well. As Tara did, I'm going to prime you with this question that we'll, if there's time, come back to in the Google document as well, which is how do or will you inspire intrinsic motivation, but this time, rather than in terms of community building and relatedness, specifically with student assessments. So how do you or will you plan to try and make students intrinsically motivated to do the assignments that we give them? So the case study I'm going to be using is this History of Early China course that I've been working on for the last number of years. There's still plenty of room for improvement. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I'm a lecturer for the Asian Studies department. I teach mostly third and fourth year courses, and they're courses on mostly Chinese history, religion, and philosophy. And I definitely get a lot of students who are taking the course as an elective. It may be the only time they take a history or a philosophy course. And so as I've been designing this class, I've been trying to meet these goals and challenges that I list here. So when I have a large class, maybe as many as 80 students, and most of them are taking it as an elective, how do I make the course accessible to these elective students? Just make it something they're interested in, but they feel they can actually do well in. One of the #1 questions I get from students on the first day is, I'm from Sauder Business School, or I'm a physics major, and they will just ask, can I do well in this class? And I always tell them yes. But at the same time, I also want to engage students in the course's signature pedagogy. So if that's not a term that's familiar to everyone, it basically just means the specific discipline that I'm teaching, so in this case, a history course. I want students to feel engaged with the approach to history that a professional historian would take. So I don't think the fact that taking it as an elective means they should only be learning a few facts about early China. I want them to be thinking, how do we build historical stories out of evidence? How do we interpret primary and secondary sources? But that can be a little intimidating. And so that leads to the third issue that I've been trying to balance in this class. You know, as a virtual room full of professional instructors, I'm sure you're familiar with the hundreds of things we have to juggle with each course. So also trying to keep students motivated, especially, as Tara noted, if they don't have that intrinsic motivation, if they don't know what history is, or maybe they have some basic interest in Chinese history, but maybe they just saw it fit their schedule. So how do I get them motivated? And the last one I always throw in there because sometimes I have found ways to make the class better, but then it increases my workload, so I'm always trying to find ways to balance that as well. So I normally teach 8 courses in a year, so I'm always trying to find ways to keep the classes good without killing myself through overwork. So Tara talked about relatedness, developing bonds with other people, drawing from this chapter in motivating students. I'm going to be focusing on autonomy, but I'll be touching a little bit on competence as well, because I think the two go hand in hand. But my main issue is going to be autonomy. So this issue of students feeling that they're making their own choices. And this is drawn largely from some work in psychology and pedagogy done by Ryan and DC, who I think have been working on this since at least the 1980s. And they make the case, and I find it very convincing, that intrinsic motivation is enhanced by both a feeling of competence and a sense of autonomy. So I think students need to feel that they're applying skills that are available to them, that when you give them an assignment, they feel like it's something they can do. It may require a little effort, they may have to ask some questions, but it doesn't feel like this out of the blue, impossible task. You've given them the tools they need. If they sit down to do it, it can be done. And at the same time, students need to feel their actions are self-determined. They need to feel like, oh, high-pitched rattling sound. I don't know if that's from my end. Yeah, so if everyone can make sure they're muted. I just noticed someone noted there's some sound in the background. So yeah, students also need to feel their actions are self-determined, like they're making the choices in terms of how they're approaching the class, how they use their time, and maybe even in terms of the specific topics and assignments that they're addressing. So back to my case study, throughout my talk, I'm going to keep coming back to this history course just as an example. So in this history course and a few other courses I'm teaching, the approach that I've been moving towards has been having optional course tracks. So basically, students at the outset can choose one of two distinct tracks, specifically in terms of their final project work. So the early assessments in the class focus on the pedagogies of history. Oh, is this something on my end? So it sounds like there's some noise problems coming from my end. Because the mic should be my computer mic. I'm not sure. Should I ask, should people just let me know in the chat, or is everyone hearing some sound problems from my end? Yeah, okay. I'll try not to move too much in case that's the problem. Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. So in terms of this course, I've been moving towards optional course tracks where students have a choice between two distinct kinds of final coursework. And I think right off the bat, that already gives students an immediate sense of autonomy in the course. So they already know they have a couple of options. The first option, track 1, has this final course assignment that I call the research project design assignment. I think I need to catch your name for that. But this is a more structured, more straightforward assignment. So it's geared more for students who maybe don't feel they have a lot of time to invest in this class. Maybe they're taking 5 econ courses. They're very stressed out already. They want to learn the material in the course, but they don't want a giant, scary-seeming independent research project. And then I usually throw in something extra, a final exam or some other assignment, so that it ends up being about comparable to the independent research project. So all the students feel like they're at least doing the same amount of effort to some extent. Then the second track is this much larger, much more independent research project where students have a much stronger sense of autonomy. They can choose a project that meets their interests, that maybe uses some skill set that they've been working on that is relevant to their lives, and they can do something bigger, more ambitious. So I'll just give a little bit of explanation on this track 1, the research project design assignment. And the basic idea here is it's still doing the work of a research project. So rather than just assigning to students, now write a history paper, when a lot of these students have no clue what a history paper is or what it looks like or how to begin, I'm basically giving them the component parts of that work in a way that allows them to approach it without feeling too intimidated. And I think this actually is one of the good cases of an aspect of this flexible assessment that works really well for online teaching as well. Because when you're teaching online and students don't have the same structure of meeting in a face-to-face class, they're maybe struggling a bit more with time management. If you can break down in a big capstone assignment like this into its component parts, they can feel like they're working towards something over the course of the term, get some feedback, and not feel like they've wasted the whole semester and now they have this giant assignment to throw together at the end. So there's two parts to this assignment. I'm trying to keep it fairly straightforward. The first is a short proposal where they explain a hypothetical research project. So they're basically saying, I have in mind this idea of a research paper, or it can be pretty much anything they want because they don't actually have to produce the final version. They're maybe proposing a museum exhibition that's historical in nature. It could be a historical novel, a video game, a board game, pretty much anything where they're going to have to do some historical research. They have to engage with some of the disciplines of history that we've taught them in class, but they can be ambitious and creative in scope. And this is just an opportunity for them to throw an idea out there, talk about how it's relevant to history, without feeling like they're working towards this terrifying research paper. Then part two is an annotated bibliography. So I think everyone's familiar with what an annotated bibliography is, but this requires them to do a bit of research. We go in class, together in class, on how to find good sources and use them. And then the final product that they do, they have to point directly towards how each of these sources is being used towards this larger research project. So again, they're doing that work that a historical research paper requires, but in a way that they feel confident, and it's also self-directed. So I've been finding, at least for face-to-face classes, the main advantages of this structure of assignment is, especially for those students who don't feel like they're willing to do a gigantic independent research project, that structure of the assignment and it's being broken down into component parts really encourages the feeling of confidence. And I really had that directly from students. They've told me that they maybe struggled a bit with some of the more history-specific assignments, but when I gave them this assignment, they really felt they could do it. And I have some really impressive assignments from students that otherwise had been struggling in the course. Second, I think, coming back to this autonomy issue, because it's a hypothetical research project, and they don't feel as intimidated because they're proposing it in theory and then doing the research, it really lets them be creative. And so I've had students connected to issues that they find interesting. And that sense of autonomy, I think, addresses, I think one of the questions I saw on the Google Sheet relevant to Tara's talk was, how do you deal with that problem of what we find interesting versus what students find interesting? This gives them a chance to explore an interest that probably would never occur to me as something that they might find fascinating. I think one of the first ones that really struck me that way was a student who proposed a museum exhibition on the history of Chinese fashion in early China. I hadn't really talked about fashion in class. She put together a really strong assignment that showed genuine passion about the material. Yeah, so question about sharing my rubric. I think I will do that. I have some other material as well that I'll share, but I'll make sure that gets included in the final material. The rubric is something I'm still working on, but in general, I think as long as you have a clear rubric that includes the key issues that you want them to be working on, including dealing with some important element of the discipline you're teaching, in this case history, I specifically tell them they have to deal with the concept of historical narrative, which I introduced on the first day of class. And they have to make sure that bibliography entries are directly connected to what they talk about in the proposal. In terms of online teaching, I think this works really well because then they have that sense of autonomy. You're connecting with them about something that they feel interested in doing, and it's building that intrinsic motivation. So track 2, I'll try to talk briefly about. This is that much larger in scope, maybe sounds very vague. It's an independent research project where they have a choice in terms of medium. They can produce a research paper. That's really useful for students aiming for graduate school or writing an honors thesis. I've had students do what I call a guest lecture, which is basically a presentation. But calling it a guest lecture, I think, gives a stronger sense of autonomy to the students because I'm basically telling them, you are responsible for producing a lecture for your classmates on a topic you think is interesting. How do you want to communicate it to them? And then third one is this much broader in scope creative project, which can be just about any medium a student can think of, as long as it seems appropriate and doable, and they can find a way to connect it to the discipline of history. So I've had podcasts, excellent podcasts, some that were just very straight and serious historical. I've had podcasts that even included advertisements for the common things you hear in podcast ads. Last year, one of the best creative projects I've ever received was a Twitter feed. I don't have time to get into why it was so good, because it wasn't just the idea of the Twitter feed. They really met all of the course objectives in a way that I found deeply impressive. I've had short films. I've had so many media. And I think the advantages for this in general are it really builds that sense of autonomy and sense of competence, partly because it allows students to apply skills that either they've been working on or which are relevant to courses that they're majoring in. So, for example, I had a film studies major produce a short film about Taoism, and it builds that sense of competency because they don't feel like they're being forced to do something totally novel. They're doing something that they feel is valid to their life and is drawing on skills they're already interested in. So in terms of online teaching, I think one of the big advantages here is for students who do choose this track, they've found something they're intrinsically interested in doing. And as long as you keep in touch with them over the course of the term, they're hopefully feeling that sense of interest. They're going to keep working on it, and they're not going to feel the total loss over the course of the semester. I did want to touch on managing the workload because this is a perpetual issue, certainly for me. I have found in face-to-face courses when doing this assignment, it does take a lot of time because for these big independent research projects, students do need to meet with me consistently. And that can be a big time sink if they're coming to my office all the time asking me these really difficult questions. But I think this is actually a case where this is going to work particularly well for online teaching because now you have an excuse to check in with those students. And I think some of the ways that Tara talked about, like Discord or Slack, could be a really good way to have that constant monitoring. Oh yeah, so I think we're running out of time here, so maybe I'll rush through the last couple slides. The other issue being assignments may employ skills that are beyond the skill set of the instructor, so that can be intimidating for us as teachers. Basically, how do I grade an assignment that's a short film when my whole life has been devoted to grading research papers? And my working solution to this has been collaborative rubrics. And my template draft for my form that I ask students to fill out to propose to do this assignment is also included in the resources. And what I've been doing is building a kind of proposal where students answer a set of questions about their own goals, what they would consider to be a successful version of this assignment, and I actually can use that to build the rubric. So that actually saves me a lot of time and effort because we're basically building the rubric together at the same time that the project is being proposed and thought about. All right, so since I'm running out of time, I'm rushing a little bit here. The last thing I wanted to talk about is just to come back to how I think these are really relevant to this sudden transition online. So I don't know if you've been taking other workshops on online teaching, but one of the big challenges of online teaching has been that some of the specific problems and issues students face can be exacerbated in an online platform. So students with limited access to the internet, students without a workspace at home, students feeling isolated. I think focusing on autonomy and having students able to choose the way that they engage with the class lets them shape it around their own particular situation. It also helps deal with the problem of students in multiple time zones because you can maybe connect with students individually. You can have some kind of ongoing Discord or Slack chat that lets them check in on their assignments. And yeah, it just lets them choose how they manage and use their time. Okay, so I don't know if we have time. It's, according to my clock, 9:56. I guess we could take 1 minute if people wanted to type something in the Google document. Since this will be a shared document, it could be useful for people to look at later.
Yeah, I think running just up against the end of the hour. So I think
Okay.
we'll switch over. So we'll have just a minute to kind of think about some thoughts in the Google Doc. I think what we'll do, Clayton and Tara, we can kind of go through the document, clean it up, organize things, and then make it available as with the slides after this, so it'll be kind of posted online, archived online, so that people will sort of see people's suggestions. In terms of things that people sort of brought up, there were sort of questions about different ways that these multiple tracks could be used for community building. There were questions in Tara's talk about kind of bringing student discussion outside of the learning management software and how that impacts privacy, especially knowing that we have to be mindful of where servers are located. So a lot of good discussion sort of coming out of the Google Doc, and really fun to see all these little anonymous animals moving around.
Willis, that did seem to be one of the major concerns and questions that came up for my presentation, so I just thought I would address that a minute before we end the session. That issue of privacy when taking class discussion off the learning management software. So somebody provided a link to the UBC wiki page about student privacy and consent guidelines, which I think is really helpful and useful. And you'll notice that there are steps that you do have to take when you take your course outside of the UBC endorsed platforms. And when you take the servers outside of Canada. So you have to get student consent for that. And if the students do not consent to be taken out of Canada and out of the UBC framework, you have to either not have that be a graded part of the course, or you have to have some way for them to join in anonymously, right? So if you took a look at my Discord slide there, everybody in that is participating under an alias. And also that was not in the Discord, that was not a graded portion of the course. So this is a platform that allows for community building in the course, but no part of the grade for the course came from those interactions there. And all of the students were engaging under aliases with non-identifying information. So those are important points to keep in mind. There are also just some resources that are provided by UBC if you don't want to get into that sticky area at all. So there's the UBC blogs, the UBC wiki. These are platforms that you can use safely without running into those privacy concerns that would be better for community building than the course management software.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tara. I just wanted to share, Tara had talked about having office hours on these platforms, and I thought that was a really cool thing where you can kind of mark yourself available, and then students feel this kind of very easy way they can just pop in and drop you a message, rather than, for instance, having specific video time or something like that. There was also another question about kind of navigating basically expectations between ourselves and the students and what we're used to. It might be natural for us to do things on the course platform, and the students, I think, Tara, you would probably agree that the students were very comfortable on Discord because they're using it for their own community building outside of the university with their friends, and I wonder if this is one place where you could lean on your TAs, right, who are probably closer to what the students are used to, by asking them where do people congregate online or something? What platforms are they using? I'm just very mindful of time. I don't want to go on too much longer. Tara, did you want to share something about that?
No, I just wanted to say if there was one message I wanted to convey here is that the limit is our own creativity, right? So just really thinking about yourself and the kind of ways that you are building community in this time of pandemic in virtual spaces, and how could you translate some of that into your teaching? Because if it's natural for you to have community in those spaces right now, it's going to feel more natural for your students to have community in those spaces as well. And maybe even give them a survey and check in with them to find out what kind of platforms they are currently using to build community outside of a learning environment.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up here. I just want to reiterate that we're going to make the slides available. The slides have useful resources at the end. These are also posted in the Google Doc, which we will also make available. So both the slides and the collaborative document are going to be posted, I assume, to the CTLT archive. Suki, is that correct, that these will be posted later?
Yeah, to the Remote Teaching Institute resource wiki.
Okay, great. So thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it and have a great rest of your day.